If you're a fan of Mean Girls movie, then going to see the musical in the West End is going to be a really fun night out. But if you're going as a musical theater connoisseur, then you're going to leave the theater just with a giant question why. In this video, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my thoughts about this musical, both good and bad, and also tell you how you can get £25 tickets to see this show if you're interested. As the reminder of the story, Mean Girls follows a girl, Katie, who moves to Illinois to start a new school year, and as part of that comes integration into the new environment in high school with new friends, new people, and new challenges. And that challenge also comes in the form of Regina George, the girl who is leading the plastics, the mean girls of the school. And this is a story that is pretty much universal, and the main reason why this movie has resonated with generations since 2004 when the movie was released for the first time. It is the universal story of trying to be accepted, finding the place where you belong, and figuring out who you are in those formative years during high school. On that front, this musical does not really deviate from that story a lot. This is pretty much like for like in terms of the plot and everything else that comes with it. They did try and incorporate maybe some elements that would make it more suitable for newer audiences, not to an extent that you cannot recognize the musical, but while they tried to do that, it didn't really fully go into the modern days. So it's kind of like a weird blend between trying to stay true to the original while incorporating only some elements that they found like they should be incorporated. It feels like it's stuck in between the original and what's new. Certainly this is not the first musical turned movie from that era. We also have Legally Blonde, which is an amazing musical. This happens quite a lot, but I guess where this took it a step further is because then the musical became the movie adaptation, which was released earlier this year and kind of faced a bit of a backlash and a lot of questions why. This is kind of the predominant feeling that I have about this musical. There are a lot of things that I'm questioning. Why was this the choice? But before I get into the nitty-gritty of why that was my predominant thought and feeling, I do want to discuss some things that are good with this musical first. And the first positive thing about this musical is just resurfacing love for this movie and this story, and seeing the fans who really love the movie get together and celebrate this story once again and having a great time. I feel like everyone in the audience was ready to have a really good time. People came dressed in pink, myself included, and a lot of people were just there to really enjoy the story that they already know. And I think from that perspective, this musical has delivered. You could buy some really cool merchandise. You could also take a picture in front of this big burn book. There are just elements of this production that made people reminisce this movie, but also it allowed new audiences to be introduced to it in a really fun way. So if you're assessing this musical from purely perspective, would fans like this? I think that the answer is yes. And for what I could witness around me, lots of people have really enjoyed this musical. And I think if that is the purpose of the show, then yes, it delivered 100% to this promise. And one of the main reasons why this musical has delivered to that promise is the amazing cast. They really did a great job with casting, and the Mean Girls as well as the rest of the cast is pretty spectacular, and they all get their time to shine. My favorite was Regina George. She was brilliant, and honestly she owned the stage in such unique way. And what I really loved about her, Regina George, is that she didn't really try to just copy Rachel McAdams and become the clone of the movie version. She really introduced a lot of her own energy and quirks, and she was a really believable Regina, and I loved her performance. Georgina received a standing ovation, and I think everyone in the audience that night would agree with me that this was definitely the performance to remember. While we were talking about the plastics, I have to mention Grace, who was playing Karen, and this role was even more elevated in the musical than in the movie. She's a bit of a silly, quirky, and deeply traumatized girl, and throughout the musical you definitely develop a lot of sympathy for her and her behavior. And what Grace did so well is that she really delivered on those quirks of this character, such as that when she was getting off stage, she would take like such a slow pace that it was really comical, or also at different points you could just see her stretching in a corner of the stage, and there were like loads of these elements where it really captivated your attention by just her being so much into her character that it was really funny and amusing to watch. The two people who definitely steal the show are Janice and Damien. They have pretty significant roles. I would go as far to say that they are almost the leads of the show rather than the girls. And I had the pleasure of seeing substitutes for these roles. So Janice was played by Bailey Carson and Damien was played by Freddie Clements. Both of them delivered these roles with such ease, and honestly, I could not even imagine how it looks with the original cast. For me, these guys were really acting like they are the principal cast. Bailey was amazing as Janice, delivering a lot of uniqueness to that role. And Janice is such a powerful character to play, which really brings the whole story together and ultimately delivers that final message of accepting yourself and being who you are, which is so important. And then Damien is a bit more flamboyant version of Janice's character, who is also full of self-acceptance and some really fun numbers, and he delivers a lot of comical elements which really boosted the energy of the show and made it really fun. It's worth saying that Mean Girls has a pretty big cast, about 30-ish of them, and I think a lot of them are ensemble members who are incredible. There are some really good group scenes and choreographies, and this is where the show really delivers, which brings me to my third great point about the show, and that is choreography. There are quite a few numbers where a lot of people are on stage or like in high schools, and then they really change fast into the next costume, such as the Halloween party or a house party, and all of this happens with such seamless energy that you don't really see any friction. It just flows, and I really like that about the show. Especially when you have these big choreographers, it's so important that the ensemble members deliver. It's all about delivering that really high energy and the rush of being in the school corridors and being in the classroom, speaking to the teacher, people arguing and things like that. A lot of it really relies on the blocking and the choreography to make that happen. And this brings me to the first thing that I want to discuss when it comes to shortcomings of this musical. And I think that the set is something that I wasn't too excited about. I think it was clever and it was really fun at times, but it felt just a little bit like they took the easy route. And that is because they had this giant LED screen pretty much where they were projecting everything. Basically, if it's a school background, there would be lockers in the background. If they're in Regina's house, everything would be pink, there would be just beds. So I think that the set, while it is innovative in some way, it just felt that it was lacking depth and it was lacking elements that would make it more spectacular. I think there are certain things that really cannot be delivered without a set. And as we've seen with some recent productions in the West End, it is possible to go fully minimalist style and still deliver a good show. But I think where Mean Girls is a little bit in between is that they didn't go towards minimalist style. They kind of tried to almost recreate everything that they need to recreate with these projections in the background. So it's not minimalist, it's trying to be a bit more of an innovative show, but then ultimately it doesn't have a lot of set. And the second thing where I feel like Mean Girls does not deliver is actually music and lyrics. Certainly there are some numbers that are really fun and engaging to watch, but generally I don't think that this is the strongest score. And maybe I wouldn't have an issue with this if this was just a new production that just started, they're like reworking it. But from my perspective, this is a really successful movie that was turned into a musical and had some of the best minds working on it. How is it really possible that songs are not stronger? I just feel that sometimes lyrics are pretty simple, and I just wish that this musical doesn't support only the story of the movie, but that it really adds something new to it. And the best way that I can explain this is by comparing it to Legally Blonde. Personally, I am not the biggest fan of Legally Blonde, but oh my god, I love the soundtrack and the musical. This is probably one of my favorite musicals, and I think that is the power of changing the story that is already established to a different medium such as theater instead of the movie, because you get a chance to retell this story and recreate something new, not just like tell it for the sake of retelling it. And I think with this musical, it felt that some songs were just there for the sake of following the narrative that already exists instead of creating something really new and exciting. Another thing that I felt was a little bit off with this show is the opening and closing number. In my mind, these are always the strongest hooks to the show. If you have a really good opening, you're immediately immersed into the show, and then if you have a really strong closing number, then you leave theater feeling elevated and like you've watched the best thing ever. Whereas like with Mean Girls, the opening number is very slow, and I could just sense that people were still chatting or wrapping up their conversations, and they couldn't really focus because it didn't feel like a bang. It didn't feel like, oh my god, the musical is starting. It's like, oh yeah, they're saying something over there, but it's not really memorable, or it doesn't really captivate my attention. And I really felt that up until Where Do You Belong, which is a really fun song by Janice and Damien, and probably third or fourth number in the show, you really don't get that big opening number. And for me, this really felt like an odd choice. And similarly, I See Stars, which which is the closing number, does not feel like the best way to end the show. And those were like my biggest issue with the music, but this is not to say that there aren't some really fun numbers. As mentioned, Where Do You Belong is really fun and really puts Damien and Janice at the center of this narrative. Meet the Plastics and Revenge Party are also some really fun numbers from the first act. Generally, I felt that the second act was way stronger, and Whose House Is This, World Burn, and I'd Rather Be Me are three of my favorite numbers from that act. And we've got to my biggest issue about this musical, and that is that I feel that this has been a little bit of a wasted opportunity to create something great. I really feel that having such big, successful story and turning it into musical could result into even greater musical, and it could really be a standalone musical that people for years and years to come will go to the theater and see and enjoy. From this perspective, I feel that they could just like not even bother with the musical at all and just watch the movie, and they're gonna get the best experience there. So I feel that despite the buzz, they just replicated the story and maybe extended life of the story and introduced it to some new audiences. But ultimately, I don't feel that they've delivered the promise of creating something as iconic as the movie. And I think that that is possible. As mentioned before, Legally Blonde is a perfect example of that. It was a great movie that had its own following, but now you have so many people who just love Legally Blonde as a musical because of the musical, not even bothering with the movie. And that is the kind of missing link for me. And I feel that it didn't help that this musical adaptation was also turned into a movie that did not really perform well, and it was a little bit unnecessary. And this is basically why I had so many whys in my head when I left the theater. I'm not saying that this is not a good show to see. As mentioned at the very beginning, if you like Mean Girls and you want to take your friends to see it, you're gonna have a really, really fun night. I went on a Friday night. It was a fully sold out performance. Everyone was in good spirits, and it's just a great way to spend your evening. But if we are talking about it in a more critical way as a musical theater fan, then I do think that everything that I said stands. You can see Mean Girls the musical until February 2025 at the Savoy Theatre, and tickets go for as low as £25. But if you're really waiting to book it, like maybe for next week or something like that, tickets can get really pricey because it's a really popular show. I was so lucky to manage to get rush tickets. I played this on TodayTix, and every day at 10 a.m. you can sign up and try for rush tickets. These tickets are very limited, and also you have to be super flexible in terms of where you're gonna sit because that's something that you cannot choose. But they're £25, and I was having a really good spot in the middle of the stores, had a perfect view, and I really appreciated paying only £25 for it. And while Mean Girls might not be my favorite show that I've seen this year, there are 7 which I loved, and you can find out more about them in this video here.